Excuse the long faces, but we're still wondering when it's going to end. The politicians can't sort Brexit out. Parliament's in a fight with the government, and normal democracy, if there is such a thing these days, doesn't seem to be working well at all. So some are calling now for direct action, protests on the streets. Could that be one answer? Welcome to Roundtable. Hello from me, David Foster. The UK is known in some quarters as the mother of all parliaments, but so far Brexit has been the mother of all political messes. Some factions are calling for protests now to reclaim the streets in response to the political manoeuvring and manipulation. We're wondering, is it ever okay for people to take democracy into their own hands?
Public anger is growing over Brexit. More than 3 years after the UK voted to leave the EU, it hasn't happened. Voters on all sides of the Brexit debate are frustrated over the deadlock in Parliament. The last Prime Minister, Theresa May, tried 3 times to get her deal with the EU voted through and failed. The current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is trying to force through Brexit by the end of October and has suspended Parliament as part of his plan. That's led to calls for direct action from his critics, who have called it a coup.
Stop the coup!
Even before it happened, there were more than 250 protests across the UK against the idea. History shows that direct action can produce results. In 1990, riots against a proposed flat-rate tax on every adult led to it being scrapped. In France, the Yellow Vest protests against the government's economic policies have forced concessions from President Emmanuel Macron. But back in the UK, with MPs in the government at odds over how to resolve Brexit, some people see direct action as the answer. Does it work? And is it legitimate?
With me at the round table, we have Asa Bennett, Brexit Commissioning Editor from the Daily Telegraph. Rob Lugg is here. He's been involved in the Stop the Coup protests against the UK government. And we welcome Ekansh Sharma, Vice President of the Chelsea Young Conservatives. Great to have you all along here. Your thoughts, and I'll start with you, Rob, on this one, on Tony Blair, who said, "I personally believe so strongly on Brexit that I would do virtually anything to stop it." What is virtually anything in your book?
I mean, I'm not here, I didn't get involved in the Stop the Coup protest because I think that stopping Brexit at any cost is the most important thing. I thought that defending our democracy was important, and that's why I think it was really important, particularly last Tuesday during the protests at the opening of Parliament, that you saw actually quite a large number of left-wing, in particular, Brexit voters and supporters turning up and joining the protest because...
So you don't think it's necessarily one and the same thing, that this is an excuse to try and stop Brexit at any cost?
It may be for some people, but I certainly don't think it is for the majority of us who've been involved in organising and participating in these protests, no.
OK, virtually anything, Mr Blair said. That's quite worrying, isn't it?
Well, I imagine Mr Blair was not at the Stop the Coup protest, it's safe to say. And indeed, we have seen when people use that sort of language and they are politicians, they are effectively the meatloaf remainers. They would do anything to stop Brexit, but they wouldn't do
Except that, won't do
and that, in this case, is direct action. They want to instead deal with it at the ballot box. They want to deal with it, the ballot box in the form of a referendum or a general election. And so this is clearly why, you see every time you go through College Green, the green in front of Houses of Parliament, which, we did see over the last few days, all sorts of people marching, throwing, making noises, you name it, just making a good old racket outside the chamber at the House of Commons. There was, they were taken to the streets just while MPs were arguing over all these things. Yet, if the question then follows of to what end, to what purpose did the protests, manifest, and what effect did they have? Well, it's interesting because obviously the chief implication of the title, Stop the Coup, is that then the Parliament would have been shut down entirely, which was the original implication when prorogation was brought onto the table in the summer. There was going to be a full fat, shut the doors, no sign from MPs at all, and then obviously the government's response was, they just get for fewer days. What's all that really about? And now we've seen really actually last week that if it was a coup, it was a pretty rubbish coup because MPs managed to pass through the no-deal legislation so fast the government
You have to wonder if, in fact, it is a cunning plan. But, Ekansh, do you see this as an incitement to something? Amber Rudd said she's concerned. She resigned as Work and Pensions Secretary. She is concerned about the fact that this could lead to trouble on the streets.
See, I do think that everyone has a right to protest, and it's the democracy that gives you that right in the first place. However, my issue lies with the word coup in itself as well. Coup is an illegal and violent seizure of power from a government, whereas that happened, or on the other hand, if they're referring to the alternative definition of coup, which would be achieving something that was damn near impossible. And I think it's a limbo that the country's in, where at an impasse where no one wants to do anything. And in times like this, we do need bold decisions to be made. And I think that's exactly what's happened. And I do think that sooner rather than later, we need to get beyond Brexit. And the domestic agenda that's being put forward is one of the ways that the Prime Minister is currently looking to do that.
Yeah, but is it an incitement to protest? In other words, it's an incitement to, what, as Amber Rudd put it, dangerous outcomes, and asked if she feared violence. She said, I do. Is that what we're seeing here? People are so dissatisfied, people like Rob and the others who were there at the protest, so dissatisfied that they can see no other choice.
I guess it's the people that are feeding or filter feeding information that benefits them in particular, or their positions or the views they hold. And often when you're talking to people in London in particular, you come across what people call the London bubble, where people look at everything from the perspective of someone that lives in London, whereas we are a bigger country. We do have views outside of just the London views, which is a very liberal view compared to the rest of the country. And I do think those comments, to an extent, are feeding into it. Going back to the point of Parliament being prorogued, for just over a month. But what not a lot of people are mentioning is the conference recess, which is just under a month every year as it is. So in the bigger scheme of things, is it really unusual as such? If we've had the longest sitting period to start with, and then...
Do you know, I really don't want to get too much into proroguing. I want to get into the reactions to what we've seen. Yeah? And Amber Rudd is pretty clear, isn't she? He says, putting Parliament against the people, constant escalation of the combat between the Parliament and people, leading to protests really unwise.
Look, I mean, there's been...
You're adding fuel to the fire.
No, I think that's obviously not true. There's been more than 200 Stop the Coup protests. And, to be clear, the Stop the Coup tagline is because, it is a catchy way of expressing that democracy is being shut down. We're not actually implying there is a literal coup taking place. But of course, most coups and seizures of powers and authoritarianism start with relatively minor things happening.
And by implication, you're suggesting that this might be one of those.
That it might head in that direction if it isn't stopped by the people. But there have been more than 200 protests around the country, in cities and towns around the country, not just in London. And they have... none of them have resulted in violence. They've resulted in peaceful protest and a bit of civil disobedience. In fact, the only violence that has taken place...
What is a bit of civil disobedience?
Well, sitting down and blocking roads for a while before moved on by the police. But whereas that's in sharp contrast to the hundreds of far-right skinhead protesters who turned up on Saturday, attempted to violently attack police and the peaceful protesters whilst chanting Boris Johnson's name. So let's be clear about where any violence is
I've read
coming
this
from
story
on
and
this
looked into the background of it. You're talking about when Anna Soubry decided in the end that she wasn't going to be at the march because of the Nazi salutes.
I don't know about Anna Soubry. I don't follow her terribly closely.
This was only a claim from one MP, who's now the leader of the Change Party, which basically means the leader of a party of two or three. And it was printed by a reporter, or written by a reporter who, in the past, has wanted to claim that the far right are infiltrating pro-Brexit rallies.
I can't say I follow Anna Soubry. I'm talking about the people who I know who are at the protests and the videos that I've seen of far-right protesters chanting Boris Johnson's name and throwing barricades at the police. They're on Twitter for everyone to see.
It's interesting to bring in that sort of level of equivalency, because I would argue that then when you have the rhetoric that the Stop the Coup protests were bringing of effectively your democracy is being stolen from you, get to the streets to fight back, that was the sort of rhetoric that was inspiring the killer of Joe Cox, who obviously, I'm not going to name the individual, but the person obviously did in court and say, sort of Britain first and very sort of far-right mantras, because they believed they had had in their heads, as ill-founded as it may have been, that the Remainers were out to steal democracy in a sense. So I'm deeply troubled personally when you talk about the coup. I've seen the photos. You say it's peaceful. I take your word for that. But when you then see photos of the Prime Minister mocked up with a sort of Hitler moustache, dictator Boris sort of style images, you are stirring and appealing to very dark emotions when you start talking about it being a coup.
I mean, I think
again,
how many times has the Daily Telegraph called Jeremy Corbyn a Stalinist or a friend of terrorists? I mean, people are accountable. We live in a democracy. People are able to speak freely about these things, and no amount of calling for peaceful protests can possibly justify either violent street-fighting fascists or people murdering a Labour MP.
Yeah, hang on. The only words you use is street-fighting fascists and the person who murdered a Labour MP. Are you suggesting that it is only one section of society, in other words, those with right-wing tendencies, that would cause this kind of violence? That nobody from the other side could cause it?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm suggesting.
OK.
I think that is...
So no left-winger could ever be nasty?
I'm not saying no left-winger could ever be nasty, but when that starts happening, then we'll deal with it. But it is not happening at the moment. And I can assure you that I and the vast majority of people on the left in this country, if anyone does start violence, will be there to the first ones blocking it.
To say stop it, please?
Yes. Yeah. Not stop it, please. We will be there physically blocking it.
Well, OK, that's going to be quite difficult. We might get on to how you deal with these
I completely disagree that the left wing doesn't show any tendencies for violence. If anything, bad apples exist within every group. And you cannot exclusively say that all violence or all bad apples belong in one basket as such. If you look at America, for example, the Antifas or the anti-fascists, as they like to refer to themselves, they're left-wingers and they are extremely violent.
Can we put that to one side and ask about protests that have and haven't worked? The poll tax, 1990, I think it was, got the government to change its mind about a law that had been tried out in Scotland that proved incredibly unpopular. It was to do with taxes that are paid on where you live and how many people lived in your house. Those protests were massive and they worked.
So protesting does work, not in all cases, but it does work. However, when you start inciting people and instilling fear into people that this is something and comparing it to the likes of Hitler, as mentioned earlier, it's something you're effectively sowing a seed for distrust. And this is what leads to unrest in society around.
But if you cannot change a law or a political process any other way, then as we saw with the poll tax,
I do not think
that can be effective.
I don't think protesting is the only way to change a law. That is absolutely incorrect. If anything, it's the least effective form of lobbying a government to change its policy, to change its track on any given topic. If anything, people should be organising themselves and lobbying the government, lobbying ministers, and lobbying various departments to make change on their policies.
Well, it's very difficult at the moment, isn't it, when you don't know which person is going to be in government. And I'm not talking about the Prime Minister, but in terms of ministries and MPs, etc., from one minute to the next. Perhaps they see this as the only way.
I would still disagree. There is still room to have conversations, and I always am on the side of dialogue rather than taking direct action and getting on the streets and spouting lies. I do believe in the right to protest, but when you are protesting, please do not incite any hatred or fuel.
Okay, here's a quote, and I want this is a test, okay, a little test to see which one of you, or if any of you, recognise who said it, because it's all about respecting the will of the people as it stands from 2016. In a democracy, a majority is a majority. Simple as that. Anybody know who that was?
No.
Okay, well, look, it's just here. It's just here on the board behind me, and that's the only reason I know it. It was Ursula von der Leyen, who's going to be the new EU Commission President, put in with 52% of the vote. What you're doing here is suggesting that somebody who wants to respect the will of the people, the 52% who voted for Remain, should be pushed to one side.
That's absolutely not what I'm suggesting. As it happens, I'm no fan of the EU on a personal level and have, as a Labour Party member, have supported...
So this is totally separate as far as you're concerned?
Yes, it's ultimately about democracy. And that, what I would say here is there is clearly a deep disillusionment amongst the majority of the public in this country with politics and politicians. And to me, this goes to something much deeper. It's not just about defending Parliament and its institutions. I want a government that will fundamentally change democracy and redistribute power and wealth to ordinary people. But in the end, as valid as the referendum was in 2016, another important democratic process took place less than a year later, and that was the 2017 general election. So Parliament is every bit as legitimate as that referendum, and democracy is not just the tyranny of the majority, it's far more complex than that.
Could I just intercede on the point that you said saving our democracy, and you've said it a couple of times now. However, every action that's been taken has been by the book and followed each and every rule known to us in our democracy. And our democracy, to an extent, does operate on convention. And lately, we have been seeing a lot of convention being thrown in the air. However, when it comes to everything that's been happening lately from the side of the government, convention has been followed. And so where is this element of we need to save our democracy if we are doing everything the way our democracy does operate?
As I've said, I'm no great defender of the British Constitution. I think it's not fit for purpose. But that doesn't mean that while you have to defend the democratic institutions as they exist, whilst also fighting for change.
So you're anti-establishment rather than necessarily just...
I'm a socialist. I mean, that's how I describe myself.
OK, let's take a look at Stop the Coup itself. OK, because I mean, there are others out there, but this is the one that's getting the headlines. On its front page, defend democracy and fight against Boris's Brexit agenda. And yet you say this is simply about defending democracy rather than what Boris is trying to do with Brexit.
I think it's what Boris is trying to do with Brexit. It doesn't mean it's Brexit altogether. And clearly, a significant proportion of the people involved in organising the Stop the Coup movement and other Europeans Possible and others do want to stop Brexit, do believe that's essential. I share some of that analysis, but I don't think that it's the only way forwards. And I certainly don't think that we can just ignore the 2016 referendum. I think the only way that we could have another referendum, for example, would be to have a general election first and have a government that is elected promising a referendum.
See, I'm wondering...
That would have the same legitimacy as the 2016.
I'm wondering how much support there is out there for Stop the Coup. You know, people can just decide it's a nice afternoon to go and have a walk and meet up with people and wave a few banners, as we've seen behind us. Because I've had a look again at another thing. You're a crowdfunding page. Yeah. Do you know how much you've raised?
I'm not involved in the crowdfunding, so no.
OK, I'll tell you. As of last night, it was £19,721. I took another look this morning and somebody else had put in another 20 quid. It's not exactly mainstream at the moment, is it?
Perhaps not, but most of the significant democratic movements in the history of this country and most Western countries have hardly started off with huge popular support. That doesn't mean they're any less legitimate. And of course, I'm not saying that people who want Brexit shouldn't be able to go out and protest, or who believe that what Boris Johnson is doing is legitimate shouldn't be able to go out and protest. That is democracy.
Rob, I'm not attacking you because you just happen to be the representative who is here. But what are we seeing? A vocal minority making a case against the democratic principles as believed by the current Conservative Prime Minister, whether you agree with them or not. Are we seeing people shout, a small number of people shouting extremely loud is what I'm trying to get.
Well, and they're very good at that. They're very good at getting attention. And I'm sure the £19,000, you may say it's not a sign of a mainstream movement, but look, it'll pay for some nice posters, some fresh material. And
well, there's a download your own poster bit on it as well.
They're, doing a sort of lean, Spartan operation, but I digress. I still would say this, though, that tactically, I feel the events have superseded the Stop the Coup movement now, in a sense, and that, look, as I was saying earlier, if it had been the original as floated by Dominic Raab during the Tory leadership contest, shut the thing down until October 31st, challenge the Queen and take on the courts as needed be, I probably would be at the process myself, in a sense, and many Brexiteers, would also be similarly. But given, and the palpable sign that the coup has not really worked, has it, is that there is literally legislation the government has not been able to stop and is now having to grudgingly accept it may well have to try and humour and,
Well, of course, and then you read all this stuff in the papers today about, yes, OK, it may have to give royal assent to the bill, meaning that we have to ask for an extension, but that Boris will be writing a private letter to EU leaders saying, listen, I've had to send this to you, but actually I don't really want you to do it, so don't
But even
don't
it's a
bother.
sign that Parliament has and is
No
having
wonder
its
people
say.
are furious.
Well, no, but actually Parliament, as representatives of the people, they have passed something through already, and Boris obviously is desperately trying to get a general election, which, as the Tory phrase goes, ironically, that Labour doesn't seem to want to have yet.
Ekansh, you voted Remain, I believe.
did vote to Remain.
Can you understand why people are furious? Why people are going out and joining organisations like Stop the Coup?
I cannot understand it one bit, purely because the country made a decision. I might not agree with it. I might not like the decision as such. However, if the country makes a democratic decision as such, we need to abide by the will of the people. And that's exactly what the Prime Minister is trying to do. And going back to the point, this whole rhetoric that it's Boris's Brexit, you have to bear in mind that Boris was made leader by the party membership, and the party membership overwhelmingly supported what he said about Brexit, which is why he is leader of the Conservative Party and leading us into this.
We were going to have four of you at this table for various reasons. Our fourth guest couldn't make it here, but one of the things he was going to say was that 1 in 5 Leave voters would be angry if Britain left without a deal. 1 in 5 would be angry if we left without a deal. Well, that sounds to me like 4 out of 5, 80% wouldn't be.
Yeah, they just want it done. And then that's why there's a certain level of ambivalence about, sort of, and warmth, actually, about if Boris Johnson wants to get all this done, okay, they'll be happy, broadly speaking.
I'm trying to establish where you think this might lead, because we've talked about the poll tax, and they were riots. It was very, very nasty, and the relative success that they had. But then you've got the Stop the War coalition in the early 2000s. That did not stop a war. So where do you think any kind of direct action protest could lead? To a change of mind? Well, unlikely.
We'll have to wait and see. And in terms of the Stop the Coup protests, it remains to be seen what exactly Boris Johnson is going to get up to in the 5 weeks where he is governing in a pretty unaccountable way. That it may well grow significantly if he tries to do something dodgy. But ultimately...
which is an entirely subjective view.
Of course, and we'll have to see what happens. I think the real place where activism will play the key role is in the coming general election, which I was out campaigning for already this weekend, and many others were, because that will determine the direction of this country for a very long time to come. And just to respond to what's being said about, oh, people voted for this and therefore it should be respected, including by protesters. Look, I'm sorry, but if Remain had won in 2016, we know full well that Nigel Farage and all of his little acolytes would absolutely not have just given up and accepted the will of the people. On the night of the election, he was already starting to, the betrayal narrative when it looked like Remain was going to win.
Let's talk about Mr. Farage another day, shall we?
Yes.
The Conservative Party, that's what we're talking about. You are Vice President of the Chelsea Young Conservatives establishment area. Do you recognise the direction that the party's going in at the moment? It used to call itself a broad church. It would welcome anybody. But as soon as you disagree with this government, as a Conservative, loyal, long-standing, that's it. You've got your P45, you might as well get on your Norman Tebbit bike and go and look for work elsewhere.
The Conservative Party has always been a broad church, but throughout the times, you will always see, regardless of which party we're talking about, there'll be certain factions that will be taking charge, that will be taking lead within the party.
But the political landscape is changing, is what I'm suggesting here.
It is changing, but the political landscape is constantly changing, and there's no such thing as if you look at Labour, on the other hand, for example, prior to Jeremy Corbyn, you had Ed Miliband. He was a centrist to a major extent, whereas you've got Jeremy Corbyn, so there has been a shift. And I think political environments do constantly change.
But equally, with this Prime Minister, he's kicking out all of those moderates, isn't he, that
so
didn't share his view. It's becoming much more of a right-wing party, do you think?
So it is being spun in that way that it's discipline at the end of the day, and a three-line whip was put behind the vote, and that is effectively saying you're voting against your government. And if you are voting against your government, why should you belong in the government is the question. And where do you stop giving people leeway to get away with as much as they want?
If anything will have weakened his position as a Prime Minister with a majority of 0 at the moment, do you not think this may well have been the straw that broke the camel's back, the camel being the public's back, and led to a strengthening of opinion of organisations like Stop the Coup, etc., because they said, this is just kangaroo court?
I do disagree. I do think Boris and the Conservative Party in general still have major support across the country. If you look at the polls, the Conservatives are still taking the lead, and Boris is still...
In the polls they are, but what about in terms of the party itself? Because Amber Rudd just said, I can't tolerate this anymore. It's falling apart, is what I'm saying.
So it's one of those situations where people are too scared of a no deal. However, whenever you do walk into a business negotiation, and if the other side is aware that you cannot walk away without anything in your hands, they will lowball you, and you will effectively walk away with nothing. And it's people, and it's Project Fear all over again, where people are just inciting this feeling within people of distrust in democracy itself and our institutions, and it can be very damaging overall, and that's exactly what Amber Rudd has done yesterday.
Let's forget the word project and let's just talk about fear, because isn't that what is happening in this country? People are terrified, Asa, of where this is going, whether it be violent street protests, whether it be peaceful demonstrations. The political and social fabric of this country is being ripped apart.
There is absolutely a increasing rancour and volume in the rhetoric from both sides. Both sides think the other ones will condemn the nation to vassalage, to penury, and so the stakes are very high. That's why they wanted to do everything they can, going out in the streets, shouting, causing a fuss, because they want to make their argument with them.
Okay, it probably is the last word, Rob, and I want to ask you once again, when will you view what you're trying to do as a success?
When we have a Labour government that transforms this country and diffuses the division and rancour in this country by actually making people's lives better.
It's a funny old world, though, isn't it, where a Labour Party that you believe would be the best representatives of the people in this country is actually languishing in the polls and facing calls of anti-Semitism. A Labour MP's just defected to go to the Prime Minister's office to work as the anti-Semitism czar. This is what I'm talking about. We are completely and utterly without a rudder in this country. No, I'm having the last word on this one. I'm sorry about that. That's only because we've run out of time. Thank you very much indeed for coming in, from the Young Conservatives, from the Daily Telegraph, from Stop the Coup, from me, David Foster. Thank you for watching. We will be back, not just with other roundtables, but undoubtedly with more on the B word. For now, goodbye.